Imagine a river that flows not with water, but with ink. In 1258, the waters of the Tigris turned coal-black as millions of priceless manuscripts dissolved within them, books the Mongols used as a bridge for their horses. But 3 days later, the color shifted. The black was replaced by a thick, nauseating red. It was the blood of 800,000 people slaughtered in a single week. The stench rising from the river was so toxic that birds dropped dead mid-flight. This is the story of the week humanity was cast into darkness, and how the world's greatest civilization was transformed into a mountain of skulls. In the year 1258, Baghdad sat upon the banks of the Tigris River not merely as a city, but as the pulsating navel of the civilized world, a jewel so blindingly radiant that its inhabitants had forgotten the existence of the dark. It was the apex of the Golden Age, a metropolis where the streets were rumored to be paved with culture and the air itself seemed thick with the scent of jasmine, rose oil, and the dust of ancient parchment. But like a piece of fruit that has hung on the branch for too long, swelling with sugar until the skin begins to split, Baghdad was rotting from the inside out, decaying from a surplus of its own magnificence and a fatal, blinding arrogance. Inside the legendary House of Wisdom, the silence was a heavy, reverent thing, broken only by the scratching of thousands of reed pens against vellum, as an army of scholars bent their necks in service to the mind. They were translating the lost works of Aristotle, Plato, and Galen, preserving the mathematical secrets of the Hindus and the astronomical charts of the Persians, laboring under the dangerously naive conviction that the ink of a scholar's quill was a substance more durable than the steel of a conqueror's sword. They believed that the sheer weight of their knowledge formed an invisible shield around the city, a metaphysical barrier that would compel any barbarian at the gates to drop his weapon in awe of such accumulated genius. High within the opulent seclusion of the caliphal palace, Al-Mustar Simbilar, the 37th caliph of the Abbasids, sat upon a throne that floated on a sea of silk carpets, utterly divorced from the gritty reality of the earth. He was a man whose vision had been obscured by the glitter of the gold stacked high in his treasury, a ruler who had dismissed his generals and cut the pay of his soldiers because he believed that the legacy of his ancestors was a fortress that could never be breached. He listened to the flattering whispers of his viziers who told him that the world would never allow the city of peace to fall, that the very stars revolved around his dynasty. He did not hear the low, rhythmic vibration that had begun to shudder through the bedrock of the Mesopotamian plain, a tremor that was not born of tectonic shifts but of the synchronized impact of hundreds of thousands of hooves striking the dry earth. It was a sound that started as a whisper on the eastern horizon, a dull thrumming that caused the water in the silver goblets of the nobility to ripple with concentric circles of warning, yet those who drank from them chose to ignore the omen, mistaking the approach of the apocalypse for a passing summer thunderstorm. But this was no storm of wind and rain, it was a geological event of flesh and iron. Hulagu Khan, the grandson of the great Khan, was not marching towards Baghdad to negotiate or to demand tribute, he was coming to erase a civilization. The Mongol horde that darkened the eastern horizon did not move like an army, but like a plague of locusts, a living carpet of devastation that stretched as far as the eye could see, consuming everything in its path. They were a force of nature that knew neither pity nor culture, warriors who could sleep in the saddle and drink the blood of their own horses to survive, driven by a mandate from the eternal blue sky to subjugate the earth. When the black banners of the Mongols finally crested the hills and blotted out the sun, casting a long, terrified shadow over the domes and minarets of the capital, the illusion of safety that had cradled the city for 5 centuries shattered in an instant. The poets, the astronomers, and the theologians of Baghdad looked at their soft, manicured hands, hands stained only with ink and scented with perfume, and realized with a sickening lurch of the stomach that they were utterly incapable of holding a spear. They stared over the walls at the ocean of wolves gathering below, realizing too late that their logic, their poetry, and their golden dinars were meaningless currency against a barbarian horde that traded only in death. The civilization that had convinced itself it was eternal was about to learn the brutal, final lesson of history, that wisdom is defenseless against a sword that does not care about books. The breaching of the defensive walls was not the conclusion of a battle, but the commencement of a methodical, industrial-scale dismantling of a hive by an iron boot that cared nothing for the honey stored within. The Mongol horde poured through the gaps in the fortifications with the unstoppable momentum of a landslide, a tide of leather, steel, and unwashed horsehair that flooded the manicured avenues of the City of Peace. They bypassed the screaming merchants and the fleeing nobility for a moment, drawn by a different kind of plunder, and directed their fury toward the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age, the Grand Library of Baghdad, the legendary House of Wisdom. To the invaders, who lived and died in the saddle and worshipped the open sky, this sprawling complex filled with silent rooms and the smell of dry rot was an affront to their existence, a monument to a softness they despised. They stormed the cool, vaulted halls where silence had reigned for centuries, their heavy boots shattering the mosaic tiles, their rough hands tearing down tapestries woven with threads of silver and gold. The scholars, those who had not already fled or been cut down where they stood clutching their quills, watched in paralyzed horror as the barbarians turned their gaze upon the shelves that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, shelves that groaned under the weight of human intellectual history. The Mongols did not light torches to burn the library, for fire would have been too quick, too clean a death for such a repository of what they considered useless extravagance. Instead, they found a more pragmatic and humiliating use for the leather-bound volumes that contained the soul of the world. Seeking to cross the wide, sluggish waters of the Tigris River to reach the palaces on the other side, the commanders ordered that the books be used as rubble to construct a bridge. The soldiers formed human chains, stripping the shelves with a terrifying efficiency, tossing the priceless works of Avicenna, Al-Kindi, and Ptolemy from hand to hand like common bricks. Thousands upon thousands of manuscripts, each one a masterpiece of calligraphy and illumination that had taken years to copy by hand, were hurled unceremoniously into the mud and the water. The heavy thud of knowledge hitting the riverbed echoed like the heartbeat of a dying giant. They piled treatises on algebra on top of medical encyclopedias, crushed poetry under manuals of engineering, and paved the river with philosophy until a causeway of soggy, ruined paper rose above the surface. Then, the cavalry rode across. The iron-shod hooves of the Mongol ponies ground the delicate pages into a grey pulp, stomping the wisdom of the ancients into the silt, erasing equations that could have advanced humanity by centuries in the span of a single afternoon. As the hours of desecration stretched on, the Tigris River began to undergo a transformation that was as chemical as it was spiritual, a phenomenon that would be recorded in the nightmares of historians for 1,000 years. The water did not turn brown from the stirred-up mud, nor did it initially turn red. It turned black. The millions of pages, soaking in the current, began to bleed their ink into the river. The gall-nut pigments, the soot-based mixtures, and the rare indigo dyes dissolved, releasing the captured thoughts of the greatest minds the world had ever known back into the wild, unreadable chaos of the water. A plume of absolute darkness spread downstream, a funeral shroud of liquid words that choked the life out of the river. It was said that the ink was so concentrated that for miles downstream, the water became undrinkable, tasting of bitter iron and lost secrets. The river wept black tears for the death of reason, carrying away the cures for diseases not yet named, the maps of stars not yet charted, and the answers to questions that would now remain unasked. In that swirling, inky abyss, the intellectual heritage of Greece, Persia, and India, which had been carefully stewarded by the Islamic world, was drowned, turning the life-giving artery of Baghdad into a poisoned vein that flowed heavy and dark toward the sea, while the fish floated to the surface, suffocated by the sheer density of dissolved genius. But the assassination of the collective mind was merely the cold prologue to the fiery annihilation of the collective body, and the mournful black of the river was soon destined to be polluted by a hue far more visceral and terrifying. The command that echoed from the silk tents of the Mongol commanders was absolute, devoid of mercy or nuance. No quarter was to be given, no sanctuary respected, and no breath left in the lungs of the city's inhabitants. The sack of Baghdad ceased to be a military operation and transformed into a mechanized, industrial slaughter, a harvesting of human life conducted with the same dispassionate efficiency as a farmer reaping wheat. The soldiers swept through the labyrinthine streets not as conquerors, but as executioners, kicking down the doors of private homes, storming the sanctity of the mosques where the terrified populace had gathered in prayer, and turning the marketplaces into open-air abattoirs. Age offered no protection, and gender provided no shield. The white beards of the elders were stained crimson, and infants were torn from their mothers' arms only to be silenced forever, the Mongols regarding them not as innocents, but as the seeds of future enemies that had to be crushed before they could sprout. The streets, designed with sophisticated drainage systems to handle the rare desert rains, were instantly overwhelmed by a deluge of a different viscosity. Rivers of hot, smoking blood cascaded down the stone gutters, pooling in the lowlands and turning the dust of the alleys into a red mire that sucked at the boots of the killers. The scale of the genocide was a statistical monstrosity that the human mind struggles to encompass. History records that 800,000 souls, fathers, poets, merchants, and slaves, were extinguished in the span of a single week. As the city became choked with the dead, the Mongols began the grim work of disposal, not out of respect, but to clear the path for more looting. They dragged the limp, broken forms of the citizens to the embankments and heaved them into the currents, treating the population of the greatest city on earth as mere refuse to be discarded. The splashing of bodies hitting the water became a rhythmic, sickening drumbeat that echoed day and night, a metronome counting down the end of an era. The Tigris, already choking on the pulp of dissolved literature, now recoiled under the assault of biological waste. The bodies piled up against the supports of the bridges and the bends in the riverbank, forming grotesque, fleshy dams that actually slowed the mighty current of the river, forcing the water to rise and flood the lower banks. The color of the water shifted from the charcoal black of ink to a thick, opaque purplish brown, a horrific alchemy of wisdom and slaughter swirling together in a toxic stew. This nightmare stream, heavy with the dissolved knowledge of the ages and the dissolved lives of the people who created it, began to rot under the relentless sun. The stench that rose from the river was a physical force, a miasma of iron, decay, and corruption so potent that it formed a visible haze over the water. It was said that the air above the Tigris became poisonous, that predatory birds circling to feast on the carrion would be overcome by the fumes mid-flight and plummet dead into the churning, bloody soup below, adding their small bodies to the mountain of corpses that flowed silently toward the Persian Gulf. The river had become a monster, a gorged serpent winding through the ruins, proving to the few watching eyes that the only thing cheaper than a book in Baghdad was a human life. The few wretched souls who had slipped through the coarse weave of the Mongol dragnet retreated into the architectural guts of the city, trading the slaughter of the streets for the suffocating, living entombment of the underground. They scrambled into ancient cisterns designed to hold winter rains, squeezed into the rat-infested crawl spaces beneath the great mosques, and barricaded themselves inside root cellars whose heavy wooden trapdoors offered a flimsy psychological shield against the chaos above. In these subterranean pockets of stagnant air, the darkness was absolute, a physical weight that pressed against the eyes and filled the mouth with the taste of ancient dust and terror. Strangers pressed against strangers in the gloom, noblemen huddling with beggars, their bodies trembling in unison, stripped of all caste and status, reduced to shivering lumps of biology united by the singular, overwhelming instinct to draw one more breath. There was no room to lie down, no space to stretch a cramped limb. They stood or crouched in the pitch black, listening to the muffled, distorted soundtrack of their world ending, their senses heightened to a painful degree by the deprivation of sight. From above, through the layers of brick and mortar, the sounds of the genocide filtered down not as distinct cries for help, but as a dull, continuous vibration that shook the foundations of the earth. The rhythmic, thunderous thud of galloping hooves transmitted through the soil sounded like the heartbeat of a giant beast prowling the surface, while the screams of the dying were muted into a high, thin keen that sounded like the whistling of a storm wind. To the minds of those hiding in the dark, starved of information and poisoned by fear, these were not the sounds of a military conquest. No human army, no matter how savage, could generate such a sustained cadence of destruction. In the fevered, hallucinating imagination of the survivors, the events unfolding above took on a biblical, eschatological dimension. They whispered the sacred verses of the Quran with dry, cracked lips, convinced that the history of mankind had reached its final, violent punctuation mark. They believed with a terrifying certainty that the great iron wall erected by Dul Qarnayn in the distant north had finally shattered, and that the hordes of Ya'juj and Ma'juj, Gog and Magog, had spilled forth to consume the earth. The sensory evidence leaking into their hiding places seemed to confirm this apocalyptic diagnosis. The air in the cellars grew heavy and warm, souring with the stench of smoke from the burning libraries and the copper tang of the rivers of blood that were saturating the ground above. In some of the shallower basements, a dark, viscous liquid began to weep through the cracks in the ceiling, dripping onto the faces of those hiding below, not water, but the commingled blood of their neighbors and kin, filtering through the earth like a gruesome rain. This was the sign they had dreaded. The earth itself was saturated, vomiting out the violence it could no longer contain. They imagined the surface world not as a ruined city occupied by soldiers, but as a barren wasteland being stripped of all life by unholy monsters with faces like hammered shields, creatures that drank rivers dry and gnawed the flesh from the bones of the living. In this claustrophobic purgatory, time lost all linearity, minutes stretched into hours, and days bled into a singular, unending night of anxiety. The survivors stopped hoping for the sound of retreating hooves or the voice of a rescuer. Hope was a luxury of the living, and they felt themselves to be already dead, merely waiting for the formalities of judgment. They did not wait for liberation, they waited for the blast of the trumpet. They huddled in the dark, holding their breath, straining their ears not for the silence of peace, but for the horn of the angel Israfil, signaling the resurrection and the final end of the suffering. Every shift in the rubble above, every groan of the settling buildings, was interpreted as the first note of the end. They were the last remnants of humanity, cowering in the bowels of a dying world, convinced that the sun had set for the final time and that the universe outside their trapdoors had been reduced to ash and silence, leaving them alone in the void to await the collapse of the sky itself. The final act of the tragedy was reserved for the principal actor, the shadow of God upon earth, Caliph ul-Muster, Simbilla, whose fate was to serve as the ultimate, grim punchline to a joke written by hubris and delivered by a conqueror who did not understand the concept of sacred kingship. He was dragged from the ruins of his palace not in the gilded litter to which he was accustomed, but by the rough hands of soldiers who smelled of fermented mare's milk and dried blood, his silk robes torn and stained with the filth of the streets he had failed to protect. He was brought before Hulagu Khan, expecting perhaps a negotiation, a ransom demand, or the quick, honorable slice of a scimitar, but the Mongol warlord had a lesson to teach that was far crueler than simple execution. With a gesture that mocked the Caliph's former power, Hulagu ordered the ruler to be thrown into his own royal treasury, a vast, windowless vault where the accumulated wealth of the Abbasid dynasty was stacked in shimmering mountains of gold dinars, emeralds the size of pigeon eggs, and pearls harvested from the depths of the Gulf. The heavy iron doors were slammed shut and barred, leaving the richest man in the world alone in the dark with his fortune. For days, the Caliph sat amidst the cold, unfeeling glitter of his avarice, his stomach twisting with the agonizing cramps of starvation and his throat parched as dry as the desert sand. He was surrounded by enough wealth to buy armies, to purchase cities, to feed nations, yet he could not trade a single diamond for a crust of moldy bread or a cup of water. He was forced to gnaw on the gold coins in a delirium of hunger, the metal breaking his teeth, a brutal, physical manifestation of the lesson Hulagu had sneered at him before the doors closed. If he had spent this gold on iron and men instead of hoarding it in the dark, he might not be dying of hunger in a room full of treasure. But starvation was too quiet a death for the end of an empire, and the Mongols had one final superstition to satisfy. The laws of the steppe, dictated by the shamans and the fear of the eternal blue sky, forbade the spilling of royal blood upon the earth, for it was believed that such an act would offend the spirits of nature and bring down catastrophic storms and earthquakes. Hulagu, a man who burned libraries without blinking, was ironically paralyzed by this taboo. He could not behead the Caliph, nor could he stab him. He needed a method of execution that would extinguish the life of the monarch while keeping his sacred blood contained within a vessel, preventing it from touching the dust. The solution they devised was a masterpiece of grim ingenuity, a method that combined humiliation with absolute, crushing finality. The Caliph, weak from hunger and blinking in the harsh sunlight after days in the vault, was dragged out to the open parade ground where the Mongol cavalry was assembling. He was not tied to a stake. Instead, servants unrolled a magnificent, heavy Persian carpet, one of the very treasures he had walked upon in his days of glory. With rough efficiency, the soldiers seized the protesting, terrified ruler and forced him to lie down at the edge of the rug. Then, with a few swift kicks, they rolled him up inside it. The Caliph became the center of a tight, suffocating cocoon of wool and silk, his arms pinned to his sides, his screams muffled by the thick layers of fabric into pathetic, animalistic bleats that could barely be heard by the gathered horde. He was transformed from a divine ruler into a shapeless, writhing log, a bundle of fabric dumped unceremoniously onto the hard-packed earth of the training ground. He was blind, trapped in a hot, dusty darkness, smelling the wool and his own terror, feeling the vibrations of the ground against his cheek. Then came the sound that would be the last thing he ever heard, not the call to prayer, but the thunder. It was a low rumble at first, growing rapidly into a deafening, earth-shaking roar as a squadron of heavy Mongol cavalry spurred their mounts into a charge. Their horses, beasts of war trained to trample infantry without hesitation, did not shy away from the colorful obstacle on the ground. The first impact was not a cut or a pierce, but a shattering weight as iron-shod hooves struck the carpet with the force of falling boulders. The bundle jerked violently, then flattened. The riders did not stop, they wheeled their horses around and charged again, and again, a rhythmic, thundering dance of destruction played out upon the body of the last Abbasid. Inside the carpet, the sacred blood of the caliph burst from his veins, soaking into the expensive wool, contained perfectly within the fabric just as the superstition required. His bones were ground to powder, his organs burst, and his body was reduced to a singular, crushed mass, indistinguishable from the earth he had once ruled. When the horses finally halted, snorting steam into the cool air, the carpet lay flat and still, a sodden, red-stained shroud that held the pulp of a dynasty. There was no funeral, no mourning wail, just the silence of the desert returning to reclaim its dominion, marking the moment when the light of the caliphate was snuffed out not by a grand cosmic event, but by the heavy, indifferent hooves of a barbarian's horse. When the storm of steel and fire finally exhausted itself, moving westward like a passing hurricane seeking fresh timber to shatter, the silence that settled over the ruins of Baghdad was not the peaceful quiet of a resting city, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a graveyard. The Mongol horde, having satiated their lust for destruction and burdened their horses with every ounce of gold and silver the capital possessed, rode away, leaving behind a silence so profound that it felt physical, a vacuum where the hum of civilization used to be. It took days for the few survivors to trust this silence. Deep within the bowels of the earth, in the stinking darkness of the cisterns and the root cellars, the living lay intertwined with the dead, afraid to breathe, waiting for the trumpet blast of the angel Israfil or the roar of the demonic armies of Gog and Magog. But the trumpet never sounded. The earth did not split open to swallow the wicked. Instead, the vibration of hooves faded into the distance, replaced by the buzzing of a billion flies, the new masters of the city of peace. Driven by a thirst that burned hotter than their fear, the first of the survivors pushed open the trapdoors and crawled out of the vents, emerging from the underworld like gray, trembling ghosts rising from their own tombs. They blinked against the harsh, blinding glare of the midday sun, their eyes crusted with filth and accustomed to the pitch black, expecting to see a sky turned to blood or a horizon consumed by hellfire. What they saw instead broke their hearts more completely than any demon could have. The sun shone down with a terrifying, callous indifference, the sky was a perfect, aching blue, and the wind blew softly from the river, indifferent to the genocide it caressed. The apocalypse had not come. The universe had not noticed their suffering. Allah had not stopped the sun in its course. The world remained exactly as it was, only their place in it had been obliterated. As they stumbled through the streets, they did not recognize the geography of their own lives. The grand mosques were hollowed-out shells, their domes collapsed like broken eggshells, the palaces were smoking ruins, and the streets were paved not with stones, but with a carpet of bloating bodies that stretched for miles, a feast for the circling vultures and the wild dogs that had descended from the hills. The Mongols had left behind monuments to their efficiency, great pyramids constructed entirely of human skulls, stacked with geometric precision, staring out over the devastation with hollow, mocking eyes. The survivors drifted toward the banks of the Tigris, drawn by the primal need for water, but they stopped at the edge, recoiling in horror at the sight of the artery that had once fed their civilization. The river was no longer the life-giving mother of Baghdad, it was a slow-moving sludge of death. The water had shifted color once again. The charcoal black of the dissolved ink and the bright crimson of fresh slaughter had coagulated into a thick, brown soup of decay, churning with the debris of a murdered culture. Along the mudbanks, the wreckage of the House of Wisdom had washed ashore, sodden clumps of leather and vellum, the pages fused together by water and rot. A man picked up a handful of this wet pulp, trying to separate the pages, hoping to save a fragment of poetry or a line of scripture, but the text dissolved under his touch into a grey smear. The knowledge of centuries, the cures for diseases, the maps of the stars, the translations of the Greeks, was nothing more than mud in his hands. He realized then that the Mongols had not just killed the people, they had lobotomized the world. They had severed the connection to the past, leaving the survivors stranded on an island of ignorance, cut off from the wisdom of their ancestors. They stood on the banks of the poisoned river, a handful of ragged, broken scarecrows, and wept, not for the dead were at peace, but for themselves. They understood with a crushing clarity that the golden age was over, extinguished not by a cosmic decree, but by the apathy of history. The sun would continue to rise, the seasons would turn, but the light of the mind that had burned so brightly in Baghdad had been snuffed out, and a long, dark shadow was stretching out before them, a twilight of the intellect that would last for centuries. The river flowed on, indifferent and heavy, carrying the dissolved soul of a civilization down to the sea, leaving the survivors to wander among the ruins of a future that would never happen, haunted by the realization that the end of the world would have been a mercy compared to the horror of having to build a new one from the ashes of the perfect past.